What is up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Before I get going, as always, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content I put out on YouTube every single week. As always, splitting the show into two parts tonight. First, U.S. national team news. Of course, the men's team just qualified for the Nations League semifinals during this international break. So we're going to talk about that. And then also there was some important news on the women's side I'm going to get to. So that is going to be segment one. And then the second part of the show, previewing the rest of the European season, specifically focusing on storylines, getting you caught up on some of the things that maybe you weren't aware of that were happening in Europe's five major leagues, as we always, are focusing on the title race. But there are some other interesting things happening as well, so I will get into all of that later. First, though, plenty of U.S. national team news to discuss, starting with the men's national team getting into the Nations League semifinals with a pair of victories in this international break. I want to start with a very general statement coming off of the El Salvador game. People who are concerned about that performance, or people who expected something different in that game, have not been paying attention to how this works in CONCACAF, have not been paying attention to this El Salvador team, have not been paying attention to what happens in these kind of games. This is the reality of CONCACAF. Now, it's a little bit different because this wasn't on the road, and I put a lot of stock in the difficulty of CONCACAF games on the road. Would it have been nice to see a more comprehensive performance over 90 minutes? Sure. The first half wasn't inspiring. The second half was much better. But at the end of the day, they were the better team. They got the job done. Sometimes I feel like there's this just unrealistic expectation that every time you step on the field as the more talented team, you're supposed to dominate, you're supposed to win, 3, 4, 5-0, something like that. Because there's obviously a talent discrepancy here. But Manchester City lose to Crystal Palace, and Italy don't make World Cups. The Netherlands didn't make a World Cup recently. This sport, more than probably any other, gives you an opportunity to make up for a talent disparity, because every decisive moment matters so much. Every, one goal, one moment can change a game in a way that it can't if it's a basketball game or a football game where you're scoring multiple touchdowns, you're scoring dozens of baskets. So there's no reason to be concerned here. The job is done. That's the most important part. This isn't even playing down to competition. This is just a different type of environment and a different type of challenge than this team had in the World Cup. And I said before the World Cup, this team is built to play in that tournament, not to kind of survive and get through qualifying and get through things like this to get to the Nations League semis where now you're playing Mexico. This is not designed to maximize this team, and that's okay. You'd rather have it this way than the other way, where teams are really good in qualifying and disappoint at the actual major tournaments and against the highest level opposition. This team can rise to the occasion against anybody. It doesn't mean they they take these games lightly. It's just really difficult for this team to be at its best when the other team comes in intentionally trying to stop you from playing and trying to make things ugly and throwing all kinds of CONCACAF-y things at you. And so you've got to just celebrate the wins when they come and not make them all some kind of larger commentary on the status of this team. Now, there are a couple points I want to discuss about kind of takeaways and what this means moving forward. One, the issues that were discussed so much at the World Cup are still there. It's not a surprise. You don't fix those kind of things with the exact same roster in a couple months. The final third is bad. Their finishing is not great, and specifically their chance creation in the final third, sometimes they struggle with that too. They're just not a dynamic attacking team, no matter how much attacking talent they have. And you saw it again in specifically the El Salvador game. It's not surprising. It's what this team is. But there wasn't anything in here to feel like they had figured something out coming off of that World Cup. It's the hardest thing to do in the sport. They're not great at it yet. That's okay. I would rather, especially again in a knockout format, when you're talking about World Cups, when you're talking about Copa Americas and Gold Cups, I would rather have the firm defensive foundation and struggle on the attacking side of the field than the other way around. But the problems are still there. And that is going to be the biggest challenge for whoever the next permanent coach is can you get the final third figured out? Because the players are good enough. The product, the execution level, and the talent do not match right now. And that's the exciting part, is that there's a very logical belief that this can get better. But it's not there yet. And to that point, I mentioned this during the World Cup. The guy who seems capable, and maybe the only guy, of consistently unlocking defenses is Weston McKennie. And that's how the goal came in this game too. You saw the same thing in the World Cup. He can pick that pass, that one moment of quality that this team has so much trouble creating. Sometimes all they need is one, and he's usually the guy who delivers it. Now, you would love to not have to rely on that one guy to do it all by himself. But that's kind of the reality of the situation right now. And he delivered again. And he has the capability to be that guy sometimes. This is also part of, there aren't really any 10s here. And obviously, they don't play with a 10. I think Brendan Aaronson's a winger. I want him playing out wide because of his pressing and his understanding of space. This is why Jordy Mihailovic is a fascinating option to me over the next few years as we get into 2026 territory. Because he's another guy who can do... Now, passing isn't necessarily his... he's not Kevin De Bruyne with the ball at his feet. But he has some of that creativity, that ability to unlock and create things from that deeper lying attacking position, kind of that number 10 space. And this team doesn't really have a lot of that. The closest you have is maybe Brendan Aronson, but he's not a 10 in a traditional sense. The closest guy is Weston McKennie because of his ability to unlock a defense like he did in this game. That is one of the most important parts of this team right now because they don't really have anybody else who's doing that. But Weston McKennie made it happen. And then on the receiving end of that was Ricardo Pepi, who had a really nice couple of games here. That was a terrific finish. As much as I'm talking about the McKennie side of this, don't lose sight of how good of a finish that was from Pepi. That's the kind of finish that, in many ways, you've been waiting and waiting and waiting to see from a U.S. striker. Why? Because he wasn't thinking about it. Because he was so confident he knew exactly what was going to happen. That is a striker informed. That is a striker who believes in what he's doing. And it seems like every time somebody gets an opportunity for this team, the confidence goes the other direction. But Pepi has, obviously he's found his groove at the club level. At least temporarily. We'll see how this plays out long term and what happens in the summer. But then he translated it when he came on national team duty. He got right back into the team after being left off the World Cup roster, and he was really good. That's a very exciting development. Now, can you read too much into these two games and say Pepi's the guy going forward? Of course not. But it's completely fair to just celebrate a striker playing for this team looking that confident, because you haven't seen one in a long time. And maybe it's a coincidence this is happening with all of the Balogun talk. Maybe it's not. But this is also why you need multiple guys at every position who you believe in. Because some guys are going to be in form, some guys aren't. You need, when a guy kind of slips, you need somebody there to push him, to not allow them to be comfortable. Having Balogun in the fold is going to push Ricardo Pepi. And if Ricardo Pepi keeps scoring, he's going to make sure that position isn't handed to Florian Balogun if he ends up committing to the U.S. That's all good. That's one thing this team needs. Every team obviously can use more talent. But it's a different conversation if you look at the England squad. I'm not saying anything new here. But there are spots up for grabs. There are not enough completely solid, 100% confident, high-level players where you feel like they're just kind of bulletproof. That's the next step for this team is, can you get to that point? You're starting to develop the world-class talent, if you want to call it that. The guys playing at the highest level. You're seeing more and more of them. That was the previous step. Now it's, can you fill a squad full of those guys? Getting Balogun into the fold is going to help. And you also need Ricardo Pepi scoring goals and pushing him if Balogun comes. So, Pepi can only do what he can do with the opportunities that this team has in front of him, and he more than took this one. Good for him. That's a really good thing to see. The second player I want to give a shout out to is Miles Robinson. Miles Robinson is really, really good. And he looked like himself coming off of that horrific injury, which is great to see. He looked like the guy who had played himself into a lockdown starting position on this team. And assuming that continues, he's going to once again just reclaim that lockdown starting spot on this team. Because he is simply better than the other center back options out there. Outside of maybe Tim Ream right now. You can't argue with what Tim Ream's doing. But from a long-term perspective and a 2026 World Cup perspective, he's the front runner. So it was really good to get him back out there and just kind of ease any concerns about the impact of the injury. He looked like Miles Robinson. He reminded you why he had become the guy next to Walker Zimmerman. I don't care that he's in MLS and that you got these guys all across Europe. Nobody has been more impressive outside of Tim Ream than Miles Robinson. He showed you again in this El Salvador game. And like I mentioned earlier, this then sets up another game against Mexico in the semifinals. The last one was one of the wilder games I've ever seen. We'll see how this one goes. June 15th is when these games are going to be played, the semifinals. It's about continuing to learn how to win. It's about continuing to win trophies. It's about continuing to assert your dominance as the best team in this continent. You got through while navigating, the World Cup and all that kind of stuff. Now it's 2 games, 4 teams. The best 3 teams from this continent are in there. So theoretically, you're going to have to go through Mexico and Canada to win, which is exactly what you want. The table is laid out perfectly. Now it's just a question of, can this team defend their title in the Nations League? And is there a new coach in place by June? It seems unlikely. Incredibly unlikely. I might even go that far. That process will probably have started, maybe not even, because the deadline or the goal was kind of the Women's World Cup to have a sporting director in place, and that person's going to pick the head coach. So you're probably going to see something very similar to what you saw here with Anthony Hudson. Maybe things move faster, but that's something to keep in mind as well as you look forward to these games in June. Speaking of the Women's World Cup, the other major development I wanted to talk about here for a couple minutes is Julie Ertz's surprising return to the women's national team. Julie Ertz had not been playing anywhere for an extended period of time. I think it was something like, I don't even remember what the number was. This was not supposed to be in the cards. And all of a sudden, Julie Ertz is going to make an appearance in this final camp before the World Cup and is currently, according to Vlago Andonovski, working on figuring out the club situation. Because, as it should be, you're not making this team for the World Cup if you're not playing regularly. I don't care who you are. This team is too good. So, everything that's been said, it sounds like this has been in the works, that she's been training at a high level, and This is done with the idea that there's going to be NWSL games to kind of get her back into the swing of things. So absolutely, if that's the plan and the intention, you bring her into this camp. You've got nothing to lose. You feel much better about bringing her potentially to a World Cup if you've seen her in camp, sometime in the somewhat recent past. So that's part of this, is just get her back into this team. This team has undergone some changes from, the ones that she's used to playing on, specifically up front, and also at the back with Naomi Girma. She needs to get used to playing with these players, and she's not playing with them at the club level right now. So, absolutely, this is the right call to bring her into the camp. And also, you're not committing yourself to anything. If it doesn't go well, if she's just not up to the standard, then you just leave her off the World Cup roster. But if this all works, and it kind of comes together as everybody hopes, she comes into this camp, she looks good, she gets her club situation figured out, that's going just fine, and she's back into the swing of things when you got to make decisions about who's going to Australia and New Zealand. This is the kind of thing that can swing the balance of power at the top of that Women's World Cup power rankings, if you will. This is the kind of thing that can be the difference between losing in the semis, losing in the final, and winning another World Cup. I firmly believe that. And here's why. I was talking about this coming out of the CONCACAF W Championship. The hole this team has is the position that Julie Ertz vacated when she stepped away to have her child, and she kind of took a little bit of a break from soccer. There are really good players who can play that position. Yeah, Andy Sullivan, Christy Lewis, Sam Coffey has gotten a run since she broke into the NWSL and had that great rookie season. None of them are Julie Ertz. None of them balance that midfield the way she does. None of them bring the presence that she does. That's an incredibly important position, and it's kind of thrown the midfield out of whack not having her. If you get her back, that you can then pair with Rose Lavelle and Lindsay Horan behind a front three of Alex Morgan, who's theoretically having another really good NWSL season at that point, and Sophia Smith and Mallory Swanson, still getting used to that. Naomi Girma at center back. You can work the rest of the defense out. It just feels so much better than having to rely on, and it's just one player, but it makes such a difference to have a midfield that that's been through this, that's been to World Cups, that knows how to get this done. Because you've got incredibly important players up front and incredibly important players in the back who haven't been there before. Not having to worry about your midfield, and specifically the player who's supposed to help your center backs and help your back line, is a massive help. And oh, by the way, Julie Ertz is 30. It's not like this is a 34, 35-year-old coming out of retirement for one last run at a World Cup. Yes, it's going to take her some time because she hasn't played competitively for a long time now. But this is a more than long enough runway to make this happen. And again, you're not committing to anything. You're not guaranteeing anything. If she's not ready, you don't bring her. But there is a hole that she can fill that changes how I feel about this team heading into the World Cup this summer. She is that important. And you can look at all of these different reasons why they just haven't been as good recently. You can point to the quality of the teams that they're playing. Specifically, kind of after the CONCACAF W Championship, you had the Germanys and the Spains and the Englands in there. You can talk about the fact that this is a transition time with all of those young players I mentioned who have not played many high stakes games and kind of got their first experience qualifying for the Olympics and the World Cup. You can point to all these different factors, but not having Julie Ertz is part of it. And so if you can start that midfield trio, or whatever it's going to end up looking like, with Swanson, Smith, and Morgan up top, you know what you've got defensively. You know you've got goalkeepers you can rely on. It changes the conversation. Because I've said this before and I'll say it again here. This is the first time we are walking into a Women's World Cup without a clear, obvious favorite. Without the expectation that the U.S. wins. And okay, that I should preface that by saying at the beginning that wasn't the case. But since the women's game has kind of evolved to the way that we know it today. 2010s, since the U.S. really emerged as the global power in women's soccer. The expectation all the way through 2019 is that the U.S. wins. Doesn't mean it always happens. But it is not coming in talking about all of our favorites. It is the favorite. And that will not be the case. Even if Julie Ertz is phenomenal and looks terrific coming into this tournament, it won't be the case. Because of what England have done, because of what you can go down the list of the European teams, but specifically England. And the way that England was challenged while winning the Euros by the Germanys. And, Spain's dealt with a lot, both injuries and off-field stuff. But that's still a phenomenal team. You get the point. Sweden haven't gone anywhere. This is the most balanced tournament we've ever seen on the women's side. Years past, previous tournaments, maybe you can get away without having Julie Ertz, and it just doesn't matter. This one, it very well may end up making all the difference. That's how important she is. That's how big of a development this will end up being if it goes the way everybody hopes and Julie Ertz ends up on that World Cup roster.